This is a brief video version of an article I published in the journal Studies in Hispanic Cinemas. It uses an urban cultural studies method to blend the film's artistic form and content, along with an analysis of its urban context, the Catalan capital of Barcelona. The film under discussion is Alejandro González Iñárritu's Biutiful, released in 2010. Among other themes, the film looks at how Chinese and Senegalese immigrants experience life in a city that has, since at least the 19th century, been remaking itself according to what scholar Juan Ramon Resina calls Barcelona's vocation of modernity. In the article, I follow what I call an urban cultural studies method to link the film to its context. In brief, this is an urbanized version of what Raymond Williams in 1986 outlined retrospectively as the central premise of cultural studies: the need to give equal weight to what he called both the project, or art, and the formation, or society. In visual form, it might look like this. What happens when you urbanize this model is that you get, of course, equal weight given to both the urban project and an urban formation. That is, art and society must be seen through an urban lens simultaneously. There are plenty of points of reference for urban cultural studies work, apart from Williams, of course, such as Lewis Mumford's work on the culture of cities, and then Sharon Zukin's work on the cultures of cities, and numerous others throughout the 20th century. Thinkers like David Harvey and Henri Lefebvre are key to this interdisciplinary area. And all this is something I've written about in both article and book form. For example, this book from 2011. So let's take a brief trip to beautiful Barcelona. As I said, the film Biutiful is directed by Alejandro González Iñárritu, who of course also did Amores Perros, 21 Grams, and Babel. And the director himself has said that Biutiful has, quote, little to do, at least in conceptual and structural terms, with those earlier films. If you haven't seen the film, here's a synopsis as it appeared in the weekly paper from Charleston, South Carolina. Ushbal and his morally suspect brother Tito are a pair of half-baked hoods who profit from Barcelona's black market, taking money from Chinese sweatshop owners and Senegalese street vendors to pay off the city's corrupt police officers. There's a bit of the star system going on in the film, and you can see the star actor as a concept as the complement of what some call starchitects or star architects. Bardem or Ushbal is the sole protagonist, but there are still a number of other secondary characters of interest who are connected in complex ways. This is still far from being as nuanced a film as Lone Star from John Sayles, for example, which is an example of how that director is able to privilege multiple viewpoints without an equivalent central star character or anchor. But Biutiful is still slanted towards making multiple characters seem crucial in the development of the film, and one can perhaps take this as a nod to the role of plurality in urban communities. Richard Sennett, for one, has had a lot to say about this. Looking at the film Biutiful from an urban cultural studies perspective means that you have to see it not merely as a tale of universals or general characteristics of urban life, although it may, of course, be both of these things, but instead as a representation of life in a specific site. You've got to reconcile the on-screen city with the off-screen city. This kind of argument seems simple enough, but it bases itself in part on studies of the iconic and indexical aspects of the filmic sign, as developed by, say, Peter Wolin, Stephen Prince. There are some great essays from an edited volume by Stuart Aitken and Leo Zahn, among others, that get at this connection. And you can even appropriate Siegfried Krakauer's notion of cinema as the redemption of physical reality. To do this, you have to push away from the Saussurean legacy of cinema studies. Saussure, of course, was less interested in iconic and indexical representation, and film scholars have tended to ignore these aspects of film. Taking an urban cultural studies approach to this film, one has to take into account Barcelona's reputation as a model city. Scholar Monica Deegan has respun this in characterizing Barcelona as a top model city. The city is championed as an architectural marvel and a spectacular tourist destination, which is all part of the discourse of selling place. Philo and Kearns have written about this in 1993, and David Harvey has also done so. One of the most powerful critics of the so-called Barcelona model is Manuel Delgado Ruiz, who points to the human costs of the vocation of modernity and who calls the Catalan capital an article of consumption containing a human society. Delgado, more than David Harvey, I would say, adopts in his many works an explicitly Lefebvrean perspective on urban space and culture. So how does the film represent or critique the Barcelona model? Well, Biutiful takes on the city's international reputation through interesting strategies by presenting the flip side of the Barcelona model. That is, opposed to the slick image of Barcelona as an international hub of capital, you have the city's dark underbelly, the city as a lived space or a space riven through with inequalities. The director relies heavily on interiors, which dominate throughout the film as a way of underscoring the small-scale stories of the immigrants and street vendors who struggle from day to day just to make ends meet. These are people who are, in a way, exploited by Uxbal and who are enmeshed in webs of capital beyond their influence, and of course beyond the influence of the main character himself. Also, the film's focus on bustling street scenes reminds us of Jane Jacobs' notion of the sidewalk ballet, as discussed in The Death and Life of Great American Cities, and also its potential for emancipatory activity and even resistance, as discussed by Delgado, who also follows up on Jacobs' work. These two aspects of the film, Biutiful's persistent focus on interiors and on the ephemerality of street life, in effect emphasize the human city, what Delgado and Lefebvre would call the lived city, the city as a use value and not merely as an exchange value or a playground for, quote, capitalists, builders, and technicians, as Lefebvre wrote in The Right to the City. If Barcelona is an article of consumption containing a human society, then the director shows us what that human society is like. Iñárritu's film is also important for the specific type of exterior it largely avoids showing, so viewers are generally frustrated in their expectation to see pleasing general shots of what is possibly one of the most photographed and beautiful European cities. We don't see the triumphant and triumphalist view, this phrase is from Lefebvre, of Barcelona as a monumentally architectural and touristic Mediterranean destination. The most notable or recognizable public spaces of Barcelona, if they appear at all in the film, and really they amount to only a couple of minutes' duration, these sites are significantly portrayed only as sites of conflict, and Delgado writes that urban space is above all a space of conflict. An important piece of the puzzle is Barcelona's urban history. There's much to unearth here, of course. Ildefons Cerdà planned the city's 19th century expansion in 1859 according to geometrical logic and rational principles. As did many planners, he had this idea that the city was an organism, the city had to live and breathe, and many aspects of his plan are faithful to this organic metaphor of the city, the incorporation of green space on every block, and of course the invention of the chamfra or truncated corner. As did Friedrich Engels before him and Jacob Riis after him in Manchester and New York, respectively, Cerdà performed a study, what he called a statistical monograph from 1856, documenting the conditions under which the working class in Barcelona suffered. He wanted to show how the other half lives. Some contrast him with Haussmann in Paris, who's said to be more complicit with power. David Harvey wrote in his Paris book from 2006 that Haussmann bludgeoned the city of Paris into modernity, and of course Cerdà may have done the same in Barcelona. The Cerdà plan is, of course, only one component of Barcelona's triumphant and triumphalist urban modernity, this remaking of itself that continues throughout the 20th century. Throughout the film, bucking the Barcelona model, the director, González Iñárritu, largely frustrates the desire to see the Mediterranean, and he does the same with the key sites of Barcelona's architectural and planning marvels. When he shows us a police chase from the Plaza de Catalunya down the famous segments of the Ramblas leading toward the sea, he does so with disorienting handheld cameras and an excessive traveling frame. A key camera tilt downward from the Nike logo on the store window to the vendors below, set up in the plaza, underscores the contrast between the city as exchange value and the use value of the city, so key to thinkers such as Lefebvre and later Delgado. This is in line with Delgado's view of the city as first and foremost a site of conflict. Later, when the director shows Barcelona's famed Olympic Village, a beautiful shot over the Mediterranean reveals on the waves the cadavers of Chinese immigrants who have died in a cold basement room. Instead of a romanticized view of one of the most beautiful cities in Europe, we have the stark, if poetic, image of the human tragedies that are the hidden cost of unceasing urban renewal in international cities such as Barcelona. That is, one can appreciate in this sequence that even the sea has been turned into a site of conflict. In another incredibly brief pan left, we transition from a view of Barcelona's monumental architecture to a short clip of Javier Bardem's character receiving cancer treatment in the hospital. What we see on the right edge of the frame are the Sagrada Familia and the Torre Agbar from 2005, which we also saw on the cover of Manuel Delgado's 2007 book, and which represents a new phase in the city's vocation of modernity. This shot links the protagonist with his urban context, and it suggests that if he is sick, so is Barcelona. Sick, of course, with a dehumanizing urbanism. This subtle but poignant camera movement functions as a cinematic redirection, allowing the viewer to contrast the city's monumental architecture and triumphalist touristic skyline with the quotidian human stories of marginality, of illness, and of poverty that form the basis of Iñárritu's film. If you read the article, you'll get more of a sense of how I see film form playing into this filmic critique of the Barcelona model, including the color palette of the film, the props, the sets, and so on, and even the supernatural narrative arc. Read more in Studies in Hispanic Cinemas, issue 9.1, and read more about urban cultural studies online at urbanculturalstudies.wordpress.com.